Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Ray, and welcome to the RayWenderlich.com podcast. In this podcast, we'll keep you up to date with the latest app development tech talk. Now, here are your hosts, Dru Freeman and Jenn Bailey.
Thanks, Ray. This is the Ray Wenderlich podcast. Welcome to episode 12 for season 9. This episode was recorded on Tuesday, the 3rd of September, for broadcast on the 18th of September, 2019. This episode is sponsored by Triple Byte. That's B-Y-T-E, Byte. I am Jenn Bailey, here with our now teenage-endowed podcast host, Dru Freeman.
Thanks, Jen. 13 years old as of this day of the recording and has not gotten off the Switch since I saw him unwrap it after his school today.
Oh, boy.
Anyway, joining us on this episode is Gabriel Peal. Gabriel started his Android career working on Android Auto. He then spent 3 years on Android at Airbnb, where he worked on many projects, including Lottie Android and Mavericks. He's now a senior Android engineer at Tonal. In his spare time, he skis and plays ultimate frisbee.
In this episode, Gabriel will discuss Mavericks. Then in the second half, I will talk about my favorite Jetpack feature navigation architecture component. Gabriel, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you on the show. I had to ask you, I said it offline, but I'll say it again. I had to ask you if there was something you did besides engineering and code, because we get a lot of young programmers who code, and in their spare time they code, and it's good to hear you get outside and do things that don't involve a computer, unless you play a very, very bizarre digital game of ultimate frisbee.
Yeah, there's ultimate frisbee it's a big world out there, and I live in San Francisco, and San Francisco happens to have one of the largest communities of ultimate players.
Oh, don't say that too loudly. We'll lose the Caterwauls to San Francisco. All right, so I am not the Android expert on this show, and you're going to be talking about MvRx or Mavericks. So can you give us, for starters, the bird's eye view of what Mavericks is?
Yeah, so I've been working on Android development for about 6 years now. And the thing that really matters when you're building an Android app is you're building a product. You're building something that somebody's going to use. And all of the frameworks and tools and libraries are essentially just a means to an end to build an app. And unfortunately, making an Android app is often more complex than you feel like it should be to build a simple product or feature, or even a complex one. And over the years, there have been a number of libraries that have helped make Android development simpler for simple cases as well as complex cases. So Mavericks is a library that me and a coworker developed at Airbnb that builds on top of some of the newer Jetpack libraries that Google built to make Android simpler, and extended them for a number of new use cases to make Android development easier for everybody.
Now, is this project now open source?
Yeah, so Mavericks is open source. We open sourced it just over a year ago. And it's sort of funny, actually. It was something that we built at Airbnb. And after having some success with Lottie, from fairly early on with the project, we wanted to build it with the potential of open sourcing it. But we only wanted to do so if it was good enough to be open sourced and something we'd actually want to maintain. And it turns out that we loved it so much, and it got kind of to the point where I knew I was leaving Airbnb to move to Tonal, a fitness startup. And I mean, frankly, I really just wanted to use it myself after I left, in addition to letting everyone else use it. And so it was half of it was for the community, and half of it was sort of selfish in that it is my favorite way to write Android apps, and I needed to get it out there so I could use it.
I know I've personally written enough frameworks working for different companies that I've often thought, if there's any way that I could just take this chunk of code that I've just spent the past 3 years working on so that I can use it again in other projects, that would be fantastic. But I guess the question is, what was it about Mavericks that stood out that made it not just yet another framework?
Yes, this is a good question. So the past 2 years, Google has started this series of libraries called Jetpack. And Jetpack builds on top of the Android framework, and it smooths out a lot of things around the Android lifecycle and saving data. But there were certain things that we saw, certain patterns that we saw over and over again. And so at Airbnb, I was on a team of a few core infrastructure engineers working on the core infrastructure of the Android app. And we were supporting about 75 product engineers who are writing features on top of the infrastructure that we built. And in doing so, we saw a lot of code, like a lot of code, hundreds of screens worth of code, both in Android and React Native and iOS. And there were certain patterns that we saw people doing over and over again. For example, something like fetching asynchronous data. It's such a common action, especially on mobile. Pretty much everything you fetch is either asynchronous from the network or from a database. And like 99% of all the data that you fetch is going to be asynchronous. And there are these little patterns, like fetching that data, you have a loading state and a failure state. And so you see one of two things. You see someone either do it right, where they have all three states mapped out, and it creates a lot of boilerplate, right? Let's say you fetch it and it fails, and then you refetch it. You have to remember to clear the failure state in the success handler the next time it succeeds, and you need to wire it all up to the user interface. And I mean, frankly, either it's a lot of work to do that, or half the time you see people just decide that it's not worth it, and they end up just totally skipping out on loading states and error states. And unfortunately, that creates a bad user experience. And so one of the core things that Mavericks simplifies is the ability to fetch asynchronous data and map it to a simple state that automatically handles things like loading and error, so that you don't have to manually wire all those states together. So we took a collection of a few simple use cases like that and added that sort of functionality on top of Android Jetpack to make it easier for everybody.
Great. And so with Jetpack having the new view model pattern, how does this improve on that, or how does it compare to the existing Jetpack libraries for architecture?
Right. So Mavericks builds on top of Jetpack view models, and view models are great. They essentially solve a major pain point in the Android lifecycle. And for those of you less familiar with the Android lifecycle, every screen in Android has a number of different states. And each state exists for a reason. A screen can be created, and then it comes all the way to fully visible and interactive with the user. But then there's other states when it's maybe partially obscured, or other states when you rotate the screen, or yet more states when a screen goes onto the backstack when you navigate further into your app. And it's quite complex. In fact, if you just Google Android lifecycle flowchart, you'll see exactly how complex it can be. There's many
we could
states.
Include the diagram in the show notes, because there's about a dozen different states that an activity can be in at any given time.
Though for the first time, I think it'd be best to omit something from the show notes so as not to threaten the listeners.
Well, the beauty of it is that you don't have to worry about it as much anymore. And so really, like, this life cycle was built all around the views, right? What's currently on screen. And when you're building an Android app, there's actually two halves of your app. There's what's visible to the user, and then there's all of your business logic and data. So what view models does is it creates a new entity called a view model that's attached to the logical lifecycle of your screen, rather than the view lifecycle. So one example is when you rotate the screen. Android completely destroys and recreates your screen so that you can get new resources for a landscape or a portrait orientation after you rotate. But that creates a lot of complexity if you're fetching data within a view. That means that you have to somehow refetch that same data or store it somewhere temporarily so that you can get it back, because your view is completely destroyed and recreated. Now with the view model, Jetpack view models creates some APIs so that you essentially say, hey, I want the view model for my screen. And if you've never fetched it before, it will give you a new view model. But if you rotate or come back from backstack or something like that, it'll return that same instance again. So it's essentially tied to the logical lifecycle of that screen. And then your view, instead of having to do all the data fetching itself, it just subscribes to state on the view model itself. Now, Jetpack view models are really great for giving you that place to put that data, but it doesn't provide a lot of helpers and tools for actually structuring that data within the view model. So what they have created is something called live data, in which you have individual properties for individual pieces of state for a screen. And so you could, for example, to my earlier example, you could have loading and error and success values if you're fetching asynchronous data as individual properties on your view model. Now, you no longer have to worry about refetching that data or persisting it anywhere for cases like rotation, but you do still have to manage that stream of data and map it to each of those properties individually, and then subscribe to them all from your view. What Mavericks does is it takes all of your state object and it says, hey, as you have view model, you emit a single state class. So now you take your screen, and instead of having a bunch of different individual properties, you create a single state class that represents your screen. And now your view model owns that state class. Whenever your state class changes, your view re-renders based on that single state class. And then we can provide some helpers to fetch data and then map it to different things within state.
That is great. So it kind of consolidates what would be a bunch of different views subscribing to the data into one object.
Exactly. If you're familiar with React, for example, in the JavaScript world, you have a single invalidate function, a render function. And render is called anytime state or props for a React component changes. If any component changes, just recalls render, and then it re-renders the whatever changed on the screen. Or you emit essentially the shadow DOM of the components that you want, and then that diffs and sends changes to the DOM.
I'm feeling late. I'm feeling late to the game here because I was thinking while you were talking about the single state was going. This is sounding very reactive in its nature.
Yeah. You know. Yeah, exactly. So that was part of the inspiration behind Mavericks, really. Some of you may be familiar with our forays into React Native at Airbnb. And I was involved with some of the work there, both spinning it up, maintaining it, and then also the decision to sunset it. But in doing so, even though it got us a lot, and even though we're not using it anymore, we all learned a ton in the process. And the concept that React has pioneered in terms of making a tree of components that are reactive to state is such a powerful concept. And the reason React is so popular is because it's been proven to scale. It works really well for small apps, and it works really well for huge apps. And it's one of the first frameworks in which massive apps are not that much more complex than small apps. There's just a lot more simple things. And anything that allows you to do that is a really powerful concept.
And it's been very interesting. It's almost like 2019 has really been the year of reactive coming into the limelight, into under the I'm drawing a blank on my own metaphor here. It's really getting the spotlight because Kotlin is grabbing all these reactive frameworks and now growing out of it. Reactive Swift and all of those frameworks are coming out. I'm going to pause for a second because...
Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah, it's really seeming like 2019 is really becoming the year of reactive programming for most languages. It's really getting the spotlight on both of the major platforms. You're seeing it in a lot of Kotlin frameworks. You're seeing it now in a lot of Swift-based frameworks. It's just really seeming to be finally in the limelight.
Yeah, and it's not a coincidence that you're seeing this all at once. React has been around for a few years now, but there have been some barriers making it challenging to implement on mobile until recently, namely the language. In fact, up until recently, Android was almost entirely Java. You could use Kotlin, but it wasn't endorsed by Google until recently. And with Kotlin are a number of new and really, really powerful language features that enable you to write new kinds of APIs and write things in a really elegant way that wasn't really possible before. In fact, things like type receivers allow you to create entire DSLs within Kotlin. It allows you to write things that resemble a component, and having first-class lambdas is such a powerful feature. And it's really the ability to write these kinds of APIs that have enabled an entirely new class of frameworks. In fact, at Airbnb, prior to the current iteration of Mavericks that we had a version that was Java-based because we had not yet migrated to Kotlin. And trying to achieve the same exact concepts the final API that we came up with was so verbose. It was not something that we would have open sourced, frankly. And just the simple ability to move to Kotlin and take advantage of all of its language features enabled us to make it 10x better than we could have with Java.
So Kotlin's now, of course, a first-class language on the Android platform. Now my understanding is that Mavericks itself is pretty much Kotlin only.
Yeah, so that was a big decision that we made with Mavericks, and it's one of the things that separates it from Jetpack, actually. So the Jetpack APIs are pretty good, but because they're generic and they should be able to be used by anybody, they are written with Java in mind. And in fact, the core library is written in Java. But at Airbnb, we had fully committed to Kotlin, and we saw it as an opportunity to build the best possible APIs by going Kotlin only. And frankly, we haven't really looked back from that decision. It certainly hasn't held us back at Airbnb or Tonal, because we're writing pretty much 100% Kotlin now.
Great. And I love how Kotlin as a language does enable those deeper features. And it's mainly the first class lambdas and what are some other Kotlin features you leveraged in the Mavericks?
Yeah, so property delegates are a really interesting language feature. In Java, there's something called the bean pattern, where you might have a field, let's say like an int count, and you often make something called a getter and a setter, like a get count and a set count function. Because if you ever want to add any extra functionality, like maybe analytics, for example, you need a place to do that. And you can't do that within a field. A field is just the value. So you often wrap every single field with a getter and a setter so that you have the option of putting additional functionality there in the future. And it worked for a lot of years, and it's one of the things that contributed to huge Java classes, lots of boilerplate. And so with Kotlin, they really simplified that. When you create something that looks like a field in Kotlin, it's actually a little bit more powerful, and it's called a property. And so if you say int I at the class level in Kotlin, it's not just creating that field, it's actually creating sort of a hidden getter and setter behind the scenes. If you were to decompile the Kotlin bytecode, you'd actually see that it is actually creating a getter and setter behind the scenes, but it can abstract that away for you. But then you can actually leverage that to your advantage. So if you've ever written Kotlin and seen the by keyword, that says that, hey, what comes after this? It's Kotlin, I want to delegate the getter and setter for this property to this class. And this class implements the getter and setter instead of having to implement a little getter and setter in your own class. So we've been able to leverage this to, for example, allow you to get or create a new view model. Normally, if you just instantiate a view model inside of your fragment, you would get a new instance every time you get a new instance of your fragment. So if you rotate the screen, new view model. Well, Jetpack provides something called view model providers. So in onCreate of your fragment, you would say view model providers of this fragment, give me a view model or create a view model for this class. And it's all right, but like that's additional boilerplate, right? You've already declared some sort of class level property that you want a view model of this type. Why do you need to then go and like instantiate it somewhere else? So by using Kotlin delegates, we were able to wrap all that up into one single delegate. So you say my view model, give it a type, and then you just say by fragment view model or by activity view model for an activity scope one. And with one line of code, it does all of the work under the hood for you. It even then subscribes to changes and then calls Mavericks' equivalent of React's render, which is called invalidate. So it does a lot of work for you under the hood. So that's another way we were able to reduce boilerplate.
That is so fascinating. So that is really, really cool. I noticed the render function being called invalidate because I have not seen invalidate since applet days in Java. And so when I saw that, I remember using that function very similar.
Yeah,
So.
It's similar. I think we went back and forth on whether to call it render or invalidate. We had a good reason for calling it invalidate over render. I'm blinking at it right now. I think the render was overloaded with something else, but we considered both, and we had a reason for it.
So let me ask you one of those horrible topics that comes up in every framework or every language, and that's threading.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
How is Mavericks handling threading?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in the Mavericks world, we have a pattern for updating state. It can only be done from inside of a view model with a function called setState. And the setState function is very similar to what you'd see with React. You pass it a reducer in which you get the current state and return the new state. So now when you think of a view model, it's essentially you have some reducers that are the only way to modify state. And then you have things that observe state changes. So now we have very well-defined inputs and outputs to state being changed. On Android, we also, for people who are familiar with Android, there's a single main thread. And all UI updates are done on that main thread. And the more work you do on the main thread, the more likely you are to start dropping frames and have a janky experience for users. So we saw this as an opportunity to move things off of the main thread for free. So what happens in Mavericks is when you call setState within a view model, you can call that from any thread. What it does is it takes that reducer you give it, and then it puts it on a queue on a special reducer thread. Each view model has its own reducer thread. That thread will then process every state reducer that's on the thread and emit the changes. And now there are a few things that make this work really well. First of all of the state updates are processed on the same thread. And for each reducer, it gives you this object. So the receiver of each reducer is whatever the state is at the time when that reducer is processed. So you can post a bunch of reducers onto the reducer thread, and each one will have the correct current state at the time that it's run. So you don't have to worry about race conditions in posting multiple reducers at the same time. Additionally, from when you subscribe to changes in the view model, that's done from whatever thread you want. But because you're just subscribing to changes, it will eventually get the latest change no matter what, and your screen will always finish in an up-to-date state. So, and I can say so we've been using Mavericks for about 1.5 years now, and it's one of those rare cases where there's a relatively complex threading model that's completely transparent to the user. It doesn't expose anything. If you're familiar with Rx Java, you never have to worry about subscribe on and observe on. All of the state changes are just kind of magically, for lack of a better word, run in a reducer thread. And we haven't had any issues yet in many hundreds of screens of many use cases.
wow, that's incredible. So when you say screen, what does that refer to? Because I noticed the word screen being described in one of your talks. Or
Yes.
when you say there's hundreds of screens, what's a screen?
So when we say screen, we are just counting the number of fragments. Generally, we have one fragment per screen, and that's really the best construct we have to measure.
Oh, cool. Awesome.
Now you've actually created a Mavericks fragment.
Yes, yeah. So there's a base Mavericks fragment that does a little bit of housekeeping, so that we can restore the right state and whatnot. But then we measure, as far as its adoption, the number of subclasses of that. So in the Airbnb app, for example, it's nearing 600 unique fragments in barely more than a year. And right now it averages over one new Mavericks fragment every single day, 7 days a week. They're not working 7 days a week, but it averages out to more than one per day.
Wow.
I'm curious, coming at Mavericks, I'm assuming that you really want to have a grounding in Jetpack, that you want to know that system. What else do you need to ramp your way into using or bringing Mavericks into your work?
So one of the things that happens in a larger organization is that as you have more and more people contributing to a code base, you need to figure out a way to get them up to speed and contributing quickly and comfortable with the code base quickly. Years ago, we worked with several companies that would sort of do Android boot camps. And historically, when a new person joined Airbnb and wanted to start contributing to Android, we put them through a 6-month boot camp. And in that 6-month boot camp, they would learn that crazy Android lifecycle with all those different states. And then they would come in and there would be many weeks of them learning how we do Android at Airbnb and all the differences between what they learned in the class and how it's different in the large app. And then we introduced Mavericks. And as we introduced something, it actually massively lowered the barrier of entry for new people to onboard into the code base. In fact, if you look at most Maverick screens, they hardly have any life cycles. It's just, they're usually 50+% fewer lines of code than they were before. And so what we're finding is that people are actually just coming in and contributing to Android. They're hopping into an unfamiliar code base and they're writing proper Android code that's consistent with the rest of the code base and handles cases like rotation without a massive history and a lot of experience with Android. So in many ways, it's actually lowered the barrier to entry. And if you can almost start with Mavericks now. And you hardly even have to learn the rest of Android. And I do recommend that you do it, but there's a lot of people in large organizations who have a lot of responsibilities. And they may need to just hop in for their feature team and do something really small. And it's really not the best use of their time to spend 6 months ramping up just to contribute something small to Android. Mm-hmm. And so there's actually less to learn now than there was before.
That sounds great because the learning curve is very steep sometimes.
And heaven knows I'm looking for something with a small learning curve for Android.
Yeah, currently there's a pretty steep learning curve because now the new language and all the new frameworks, which is it hard to add Mavericks to your own project? Is that something a beginner can tackle?
Yeah, so on the Mavericks GitHub repo, there's a few steps. It's about 4 or 5 lines of code in total to go from 0 to you're actually writing features in Mavericks. So it's pretty simple to integrate, and all of the steps are in the GitHub.
That is awesome.
How is the community doing right now for the use and the contribution?
Yeah, I mean, it's been really, really good. I've been fairly active in the community trying to understand who's using it and what people are using it for. And one of the funny things about an open source project is you can't stick in analytics to know which apps are actually using it and at what scale. The best you can do is look at GitHub stars contributions and go talk to people. So Mavericks is sitting at about 3,500 stars on GitHub right now. And I've worked with a number of people at different companies from Dropbox to Wayfair and a number of other companies who are either working on it or currently in the process of integrating it into their app. And I'm sure there are many more than that. We do get contributions from others, or when we do things, people are commenting on them. So I wish, I'm genuinely curious what that full list of companies that are using it are, but sometimes it's hard to know with open source.
All right, I have to ask this question. Have you thought of taking Mavericks cross-platform so that you could have a common source base?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's not the first, multiple people have asked us that. Now with the introduction of Kotlin multi-platform, it is possible to start writing these platforms to be truly cross-platform. And I'm personally really excited about the potential of multi-platform and how it can enable things like this. For Mavericks, I would say, I'm not sure right now. It's kind of TBD, but I would say this. Mavericks is written with the goal of making Android development simpler, and it turned out to be a pretty useful pattern. So I know at Airbnb, they've experimented with a totally custom build of Mavericks for iOS built on top of iOS paradigms. And as far as I know, that's been going pretty well. The other thing is that the entire API surface area of Mavericks is tiny. It's like 3 APIs. There's a view model, there's some delegates to create one, and then there's the ability to subscribe to states. And then all of the rest of it is doing the crazy wiring through the Android framework to smooth out a lot of its rough edges. And all of the crazy stuff under the hood for Mavericks is with the goal of just simplifying things to make that final API surface really small. Mm-hmm. So I would say that if someone wanted to build Mavericks for iOS, really replicating the surface area is super simple. And then the rest of it, as most of the code in Mavericks is very Android specific right now.
That makes sense. So one of the questions that I like asking people on the show is, if engineers from this technology you like working in were listening, what would you ask for? What would you want? Obviously, you're one of the primary engineers working on this. Where do you see Mavericks going? Let me back that question off. What do you see coming next for Mavericks? What do you see growing in the platform or in the framework that isn't there quite yet?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we have a couple things as far as new functionality. So we have a pull request up right now, which uses another new Jetpack library called saved state. And by leveraging this new saved state library from Jetpack, we're able to remove the requirement to have a custom base activity. And that's a huge win for people who want to integrate Mavericks into their app. Now, it's easy enough to do it today, but we want to make it as simple as possible, and that's a way to make it even simpler. Another big thing that's happening in the community is a major adoption of coroutines. And right now, Mavericks works just fine with coroutines. And we're using it with coroutines at Tonal and same at Airbnb. But I think there's a lot we can do to leverage coroutines and a lot of the optimizations that are done in the compiler to make the internals of Mavericks even faster. And beyond that, I'm really curious to know from the community what's working and what's not. We just released Mavericks 1.1, and it's a very minor update. It's 1.1 because we added 2 new scopes for view models, parent fragment view model and target fragment view model. And that's the first new API we've added in over a year. Mm-hmm. And since we released Mavericks, hundreds and hundreds of new screens have been built on it. Here at Tonal, we've adopted it for 100% of the new work we do. It's a different industry, different use cases. It's in fitness. It has crazy screens with video and audio, and frankly, what's there has worked. And we've been having trouble finding like exactly what we want to do next. And in some ways, it almost looks like it's not under active development because there aren't frequent commits going in all the time. But I think it's also something I'm kind of proud of because we haven't had to either. Maverick solves a very specific set of problems, and it seems to be doing a good job at that. And any additions to that have to be balanced against new APIs that people have to learn. And as you mentioned, things like onboarding, right? We want Mavericks to be simple. We want to reduce the barrier of entry for people to be writing code on Android. And keeping that surface area small and staying specific to some focused tasks could be really beneficial.
Are you getting a lot of guidance, not guidance, but are you finding Jetpack and the changes that happen in Jetpack sometimes steer what you're working on?
Yeah, so the save state change is a great example. This didn't exist until recently. In fact, it's still in alpha, which is why we haven't merged that PR yet. But as they're moving forward and they're doing these new things, we want to make sure that we help people stay up to date and we make Mavericks as modern as possible. Now, one of the things that I often recommend people who are getting started with Android is really to stay as close to sort of the Google recommended path as possible. And there are a few reasons for that. One, they have a renewed investment in making that a really good experience. I think Jetpack at its core is really a testament to the fact that Google is like, hey, Android development is too complex. We want to make it easier. And so they're building sets of very specific libraries like Room and view models and navigation that solve very specific problems, and they're going to continue to do that. And so the further you move from the standard Google path of Android development, the harder it becomes to adopt these kinds of things. Fragments are a good example of that too. So fragments have been sort of loathed by the community for years, right? They're very complex. They have all the same lifecycle problems. In fact, they introduce a host of new lifecycle problems in those crazy lifecycle view charts. But at the same time, they're investing in them now. They recognize that this is a challenge, and they're not only improving fragments, but they're building new libraries on top of it. And so moving away from them means that you either have to reinvent the wheel or figure out some way to like shoehorn the latest and greatest new stuff onto whatever you decided to use. instead of fragments, which is why we chose to stick with fragments and Jetpack with Mavericks.
That sounds great. Do you think Mavericks will ever get adopted? And that's kind of a facetious question, but I remember seeing with the Google Assistant a library from Ticketmaster in Kotlin so that you wouldn't have to use JavaScript. And now it looks like Google's recommending their take of that library, if I understood that correct. Do you think Mavericks will ever become a project that becomes the standard?
Never say never. I certainly have a relatively close relation to some of the people over there at Google and on the Jetpack team. So I would say, I don't know. I couldn't give you an answer.
It's if it lowers the barrier to entry, if it makes it easier, that is such a plus right now. And so I love the new emerging technology, but it's a bit of a learning curve when you've been doing stuff the same way for a long time. That seems normal. So, but I'm so excited about the new reactive frameworks because they're just so cool. And I'm looking forward to the day that it's actually a lot less work.
iOS engineer have no idea what you mean by doing things same way over again.
Yeah, and I'm thinking back to the Java days where it's like, okay, I'm familiar with these patterns and there's a lot of steps to them. And, now the modern stuff is like, well, I'm learning a whole new pattern, but I hope it's an investment in being able to be more productive.
And it's one of those things, like we're all software engineers here, and we write code and we solve problems, and doing the same thing over and over again, frankly, gets really boring, right? If you're just turning a crank and you're like a feature factory, you're going to burn out, you're going to get bored. And change for change's sake is definitely not what we're going for here, but a constant drive to make things better is where this comes from. And I think that, I'm personally really excited to learn new things, because even if you don't end up using that, it's the fragments of ideas, and something might not be worth it, but then it has great ideas. Like, for example, React Native at Airbnb, it actually, we got a lot out of it. And so I want to be clear that the simple fact that we sunset React Native at Airbnb doesn't mean it was a failure. And it doesn't mean that it was necessary when we introduced it. But there were so many things that we learned from that process that certainly Mavericks came out of it, and other things within the repo that we just take the best ideas and you can apply it to anything.
That is awesome. I can't wait to try the framework. I noticed you have a Castor.io course out there. So that looked really good, really intriguing.
And we'll put a link to that in the show notes as well.
Yeah.
Yes, I'd love to learn more to see the simplified view model framework.
Yeah.
Now you have a couple of videos on YouTube, if I'm correct. Do you speak at conferences?
Yes.
Do you have any speaking things coming up?
Just last week, I spoke about Mavericks at DroidCon New York. And cool. So if you look this up on YouTube, there's a DroidCon Italy talk earlier this year. And the New York talk is a modification of that, in which I changed up a few things and also switched from Epoxy, which is a Airbnb recycler view library, to data binding, which is another Jetpack library, which is extremely fun and works very, I'd never used data binding before this. I'd always kind of been curious, and I was like I was saying before, you use this now as an opportunity to learn something new. Mm-hmm. So I tried rewriting this sample app with data binding, and it kind of blew my mind how well the two work together.
That is great to hear. I was going to ask about what is epoxy, and so you kind of preemptively answered my question, because data binding sure is really cool from what I've seen. Less work.
Yeah, no, it's pretty amazing, and it makes the fragment with data binding is like almost, you feel like you're cheating. You have your invalidate function, which you get the state every time it changes, and you say your binding.state equals state, and your whole layout, the entire screen updates. It's pretty crazy.
That is just amazing. That reminds me of almost like a Visual Studio, C# type stuff, where you can just bind it right to the database field. And so data binding looks so cool.
Right. And
will that be in the next release?
Well, I mean, the thing is that you don't need it. You don't need a new release for it. It simply works out of the box. So Mavericks really doesn't care what you do at that state. It emits that state. You can bind it to views yourself. You can use epoxy, which we could talk about if you'd like. We can use data binding. You can really use anything. It took no changes in Mavericks whatsoever. In fact, if you go to the Mavericks repo now, I've actually landed those changes that actually replace epoxy with data binding. There are epoxy examples in the repo as well, but I wanted to make sure that there are some data binding ones now too.
Oh, great.
Can you give me a quick lowdown on epoxy?
Yeah, so epoxy is another one of those libraries we built at Airbnb where we saw people building the same things over and over again that required a lot of boilerplate. So Recycler View is this complex view in Android that used for long lists of data. And it's, I think, UI collection view, is that right, on iOS?
Probably. Could be a table view or a collection view.
Yeah, something like that, where you're recycling or reusing views as they scroll off screen. And it works really well if you have a long, homogeneous list of items. But things get really complex when you have a heterogeneous list, because you have something called an adapter. And in your adapter, you have to have a unique view type for each individual type of item you have in your list. So let's say you had a list with a header and then like a bunch of other things. Once you have more than 3 or 4 things, and maybe they can be in different orders, it gets so complex, people just kind of give up, or maybe just put them in one super tall view in which the whole thing is rendered at any given time. So we created something that you basically write it's funny, it's a similar reactive pattern. You take a custom view, and that represents something that can be a row in your list. And then you annotate it with model view, which comes with epoxy. Then epoxy will generate a component, an epoxy component. It's similar to a React component for that view. And then whenever in your main view, in your screen, whenever that data changes, you just say, hey, epoxy recycler view, my data changed. And it calls something similar to your invalidate function, and you just return a list of the components that you want. And these components, again, they're generated based off of your custom views with an annotation processor, and they're just like the name and then a series of properties, super similar to what you'd see with React. And epoxy will then diff your components that you returned against what it knows has been rendered on a background thread, and then dispatch only the necessary changes to the screen. So instead of making a crazy adapter with view types and keeping all the indices lined up, you just say, I want a header view, and then like a description view, and then like row 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And it just works. If you want to insert a row, maybe you have a conditional in there, you're like, if this is true, put this other component in there. And then you have this heterogeneous list with animations and everything that you'd normally get with Recycler View. And then if you get it to the point where it's easy enough to build pretty much any screen with this, and we did this at Airbnb by building all of our core design language components and making them available in epoxy, you get an additional benefit that all of your screens are now lazy rendered, because you're emitting a list of components, but because it's backed by Recycler View, only the ones that are above the fold are actually being rendered. And as you're scrolling, it's unbinding the ones above the screen, reusing views and rebinding new ones at the bottom of the screen. So this is something you kind of get for free when you use epoxy.
Nice. Very, very similar to the DQ'd views in collections and tables.
Right.
In our first half, we've been talking to Gabriel Peal about the Mavericks library. When we come back, I will talk about my favorite component, the navigation component. And now some words from our sponsor, that's TripleByte, Byte, B-Y-T.
This RayWenderlich.com podcast is brought to you by TripleByte. Applying to programming jobs sucks. You have to put the right keywords in your resume, You spend hours and hours on phone screens, take-home projects, and that's assuming the company even responds to your interest or your cover letters. Well, if you're a software engineer, TripleByte can help.
They work with over 400 top tech companies, from big names like Dropbox and Adobe to exciting startups. You do one brief online interview with them, and if you do well, you get to go straight to the final interviews with the companies on their platform. It's like the common app for software engineers. TripleByte does not look at your resume or where you went to school. All they care about is if you can code.
And I can appreciate that. Being in the industry for 35 years, I'm entirely self-taught. My undergraduate study was in theater, and I left school to do my first job, so I don't carry a bachelor's, no bachelor's of arts, no bachelor's of science, and that's the one thing I'm often trying to hide or misdirect on my resume. With TripleByte, they'd care more about the coding experience that I have and not worry about that one little fact.
Apply now at triplebyte.com/Ray. That's triplebyte.com, byte, BYTE, as in 8 bits. As a special offer for listeners of this show, if you take a job through TripleByte, they'll offer you a $1,000 signing bonus.
And again, a special thanks to TripleByte, that's BYTE, for sponsoring this episode and all episodes this season of the Ray Wenderlich podcast. We're back with section 2, and Jen is going to be bringing us up to speed on her favorite Jetpack feature, the navigation architecture component. So Jen, give us the lowdown. What is it?
Great. So I would compare the navigation component to Android is like a storyboard in iOS. It is a way of navigating between activities or fragments. And there's a visual editor included with Android Studio with that component that allows you to physically drag those views onto the screen and make actions or connections between them. And then you can define passing values and define some of that behavior, such as animations, all in a nice visual editor. So if you've used Xcode, it'll feel like a familiar feature. It reminds me of when there was constraint layout versus auto layout. Now someone from the iOS world can use constraint layout and kind of feel like some of the tools are familiar.
And this is an add-on from Jetpack?
Yes, so this is part of the Jetpack. It's an architecture component from the new library. And when I saw it, I got really excited because before you would just have to declare an activity and declare an intent, and you would start those activities in your code. And you didn't have anywhere a visual of the flow of the program. So a lot of times I was drawing a storyboard on pen and paper and having to keep track of that in my code. Like, when am I going to launch an activity? Or when am I going to launch it as part of an intent? And so navigation component was first announced at Google I/O 2018. And it has since become the standard. So when I was looking at Google's blog, it said, today we are introducing the navigation component as a framework for structuring your in-app UI with a focus on making a single activity app the preferred architecture. So as I understand it, it's now the preferred architecture. And I try to use the most modern things that I can. I like the bleeding edge, so I like to stick with everything new, adopt it as soon as it's the recommendation. And especially teaching, you want people to leave with the most modern skills that you can, understanding the modern vocabulary. And so I tried this first last spring, and it was a little buggy, and I didn't have too much trouble with it though. So it was a little buggy, and now they have some more stable versions out. And it's built right into the Android Studio after version 3.2.
Now they say they recommend you use it with the single template, but does it work with the other ones?
Yeah, I believe you can have multiple activities. So I think the single activity app, if I understand that pattern, is to have like one activity and you're going to load fragments inside of that.
Okay.
So that it's not multiple activities anymore. That's the navigation that I prefer to use. So I really like that pattern. It's easy to implement. Then you're just creating fragments And I avoided fragments like the plague, I will admit it. So this, I tried to avoid them everywhere possible, even though when they were first out, I used them because I thought that that's what everyone would use always. And then I started to avoid them for a while. And now with these newer reactive frameworks and components, I'm back to using fragments. It would sure be a lot easier, or it is a lot easier with stuff like navigation component and Mavericks when the state is managed and you don't have that crazy life cycle, then there's nothing really to be afraid of with the fragments.
I mean, one of the other advantages of having a single activity app is that it really allows you to have full control over the view hierarchy. An activity is ultimately backed by a new window at the operating system level within Android. And if you switch from one activity to a new activity, there's a lot of underlying process that happens within the OS to take a new activity, get a new window, animate windows. There's a lot under the hood there. And if you want to do things like shared element transitions, it requires work in the Android platform itself. So it behaves a little bit differently in different versions of Android, and there are bugs, and there's a lot of overhead there. But ultimately, within your app, it's great when everything is just a single view hierarchy, because even if it doesn't do exactly what you want, you have all the views available to you, so you have full control. A similar thing happened a few years back when Android moved the toolbar from being part of the activity Chrome into just a view that you drop in. So it used to be part of the actual theme for your activity, and it was stuck at the top, and it interacted with the Android operating system. But if you needed to do things like have it move or translate or change in any way, you were kind of stuck. And so there were libraries that helped you move it into the view hierarchy and do things with it. But ultimately, Google is moving in a direction where everything is just a view in one view hierarchy, and then you can manipulate it and work with it however you want.
And you're basically just swapping in views and swapping out views, or transitioning or animating views to get your transitions throughout a single activity life cycle.
Exactly, and that's ultimately what a fragment is. When onCreate view is called, you return a view, and that's just a normal view hierarchy view, and that gets inflated into its container, which is another view. Same with the fragment that you're going to or exiting from.
That is excellent to understand. And it's what's great about fragments. And so to use the navigation controller, it's important to understand like some basic navigation principles. And I don't design apps every day, so I went through these just to kind of guide my mind on, how should I design the navigation in my app? I'm embarking on a new app so that I can practice all these new features. And so at the starting point was navigation. How do I want to go between these views? So one navigation principle is a fixed start destination. So like all programs, an app is going to need a starting point or a launcher, fragment, or activity. So you have to pick the first one, and you can designate that in the visual editor. And then you have to think about the state of the navigation at any given time. So that is managed by the backstack. And I heard Gabriel use that term. If you're not familiar with the backstack, it's a stack. And if you're not familiar with stacks, which I know most people are, but think of the lunch trays and the lunchrooms that you can push trays onto the top, but trays don't come out of the bottom. So the first one on the stack is going to be the first one, or the last one on is going to be the first one off.
LIFO.
Yes, I always get those confused. But as I navigate through the different fragments or activities in my program, the one that I just left is or am just going to is going to get pushed onto the back stack. And so when I hit the back button, we can pop that stack and go back one. And that's how you can keep track of the order of the views that you've visited. So navigating to a new destination, we'll push it on top of the back stack. Another navigation principle is that the up and back buttons behave identically. that the back button's at the top of the screen and the up, or the back button is in the system navigation, excuse me, the up button is at the top right. So I always get those confused, but those should have the same behavior of going back a destination. And then, so the difference there is the up button should not exit the app. However, the other button can. So they both navigate backwards the same, but the up button can exit, the other one should not. And then deep linking can sometimes simulate manual navigation. So what deep linking is you use a URI, and that can navigate to a specific point in an app, or in your own app or another, if I understand that correctly. Mm-hmm. So I also play with deep linking with Google Actions as well, because that's a cool up and coming thing to add to your app.
Deep linking is just a wonderful way to find your way into an app from another app, and just a specific place in there, rather than having to have the user navigate all the way down.
Yes, and what's really cool about the navigation component with deep linking is it'll create a convincing backstack for that. So if I deep link into an app and I'm viewing maybe the detail view of something from a list, it'll have the list view in the backstack. It'll automatically synthesize that backstack for you.
That's
so
nice.
That is pretty cool.
Because I know.
Is there a way to control whether it creates that synthetic backstack for you?
That's a really good question. I didn't come across that information. It does say it replaces it. So if you had the app open before, if you deep link back into the app and a new record is showing, the original backstack will be replaced with the synthesized one. So I did not notice. I'd have to refer back. I think that'd be a good one to solve with an experiment. I don't know if that's in the documentation.
Because I
That's
know
an interesting one.
I'm being really, really bad with my new iOS app, because 9 times out of 10, when you go back to the app, it goes back to the home page and just starts you at the top of the stack and doesn't actually link you 4 or 5 levels into the stack, or remember that you were 4 or 5 levels into the stack. Just like, yeah, start again. You weren't noticing that.
And you are allowed to manually manage your backstack in your app. So you're not stuck with just the newest destination. An example would be like an app that has a web view in it. Maybe you would want your back button to visit the last page they visited instead of the last screen of information they were on. So you could, or that's overriding the behavior of the button. But you can have leverage some control over the backstack and have it be in the order you want. And there's different features for that. I just recently am trying to publish an iOS app, and I forgot to put a back button on a form, and that's the one last little.
Yeah, unfortunately, you don't get that automatic back button that you get on Android. And I have written many pages where I've gone into the new functionality, and then I test it out and realize, well, I'm stuck here now. I have no way to get out of that. I got to put the UX element in because, well, we have no choice. We have to put the UX element in for backwards.
Yeah, I had to laugh a little bit because I think that's the last detail before the app will publish. So it got my app rejected because I was like, well, where's the back button? But so how do you implement the navigation into an app? That's a question that I'll talk about a little bit too. Like, how does all this work? The first step is in Android Studio, you add a graph. So there's a way that you can add an XML resource, and it'll make a navigation folder in your resources folder. And it'll put a graph in there, which is essentially an XML file that contains your destinations and your actions. So your destinations are fragments or activity. And your actions, in iOS, we call those segues, but that's the link between them. So it's, instead of UI views and segues, we have destinations and actions. And so, yeah, actions are the logical connections between your destinations, and you can define the paths through your app with those. You can view it in the editor as XML, or there's a visual editor that looks just like a storyboard. So you can see it and click and drag. You don't have to hold command when you click though. So to create an action, I'm making fun of Xcode a little bit. You can just click and drag. That's
Hashtag I love you, Xcode.
Yeah. So in Xcode, you have to command drag some stuff. But
yes, we've learned over the season that there's one command key to rule them all, so that you can do everything from the keyboard in Android Studio.
yes, and also, yeah. And now I already forgot it, but it's my favorite quick key in Android Studio is now the quick key to look up quick keys.
Was it
Before that, it was Alt Enter. Huh?
Is it like Alt Enter or something? Command Enter?
Shift.
I think. Yeah,
Shift
that is.
You're like, I give up. It'll search anything, anywhere in IntelliJ. It's like all in one. It's your grab bag.
That is my favorite, most incredible shortcut.
Actually, I'm curious. Now, it's because one of the interesting things about these navigation graphs is that they have a UI and they're backed by XML. I think, and storyboards are not, right?
Well, storyboards are in fact backed by XML, but it's a proprietary XML, and it's really complicated, and it's one of those things that you don't want to have to diff them for your Git check-ins. You basically want to do something surgical and then say, this is what I changed, and everyone else back away slowly. So having a simpler XML for that, I guess what happens is you get that standard trade-off, which is it's simpler XML, but you're not going to get necessarily as robust functionality out of the graph that you might get otherwise. But thinking in the storyboard,
functionality, what are you missing there?
Well, the thing is that the storyboard's also doing all of your constraints and all of your layout as well. So it's not just the segues and the destinations, it's actually all of the graphic, the layout, the widgets, the widget fonts, the widget colors, all of that is in one. Whereas is what I'm learning in Android, you have a color XML and you have a text XML and you have strings XML and I guess you have the storyboard or the navigation XML. So what happens is you're trading off multiple files for one overblown file.
Got it. Now, do you find yourself using the XML or the navigation graph UI more often?
I take the same approach I take with layouts too. I oftentimes will use the visual editor to be quicker, but I tend to do most of it at the XML level, and I always check the XML after I use a visual editor to help myself learn. So I always, and also to look for any mistakes that the visual editor, not so much mistakes, but maybe misinterpretations. So I love that. I like that approach to design and development all the way back using Dreamweaver, where it was so nice to be able to visually do your web page a little bit, but you had utter control.
Well, the code is that the code is that lowest level where you can finesse it exactly the way you want it. With the graphic, you're always going to be approximating and things will look good, but then when you go down to the code level that's reflected, that's when you can say that that's the exact finesse that I wanted.
And once I know what I'm doing, like with layouts, I'm very familiar with those. Then I prefer the XML because it's so quick with code completion that I'm actually quicker typing it in. So, but when I'm first starting out, I usually drag and drop the controls on there, then go look at the XML and see what that looks like. But yeah, it's sometimes faster for me to type. I really like how in Android, I love the point you brought up, Dru, about it all being one XML file. That's something I really enjoy about Android. That might be why I'm more in the Android side of things than iOS. I love how that's piecemeal because have you ever deleted your storyboard?
Oh, I've I have to
That's
admit,
a
I also
horrible
am one of
thing.
those crazed, I need to get, and I need to get often and get small. So, but I have more than my share of storyboard check-ins, because you will just look at the storyboard and Xcode will make a modification to it.
Yeah.
And I will
So
have many check-ins that are basically, my navigation has Xcode drift in it, where I have not actually changed anything. I just made the mistake of looking at it.
I like that Xcode drift.
yeah.
You look at it
I've
the wrong way.
accidentally, yeah.
Don't look at me in that tone of voice.
They have a life of their own. So I think it has some great convenient features and it's very usable, but Android makes me feel more in control with those XML files underneath.
I hear that a lot.
Is this the iOS bashing podcast now? Because
No.
And I love a lot of things about Xcode too. So I have lots of fun developing iOS, but Android makes me feel safe when it comes to XML files. And,
that's a new one I haven't heard. It makes me feel safe. No, that's a bad touch IDE. We're gonna edit that out.
Oh dear. Oh my goodness.
We'll edit that one out. Let's just get back to it.
Oh dear. Okay, so yeah, so once you've in your graph, you have to add your destinations, and those have some attributes. So there's a type, whether it's going to be a fragment, an activity, or a custom class. It has to have a label, and then of course an ID. So each destination is going to have an ID, and you can have a class associated with that. And when you're adding your destinations, you have to designate one as the starting destination. So back in the manifest, we designate our starting launcher activity as well. So in your graph, you have to say which is your starting destination. And there's a little house button for that. So like a home destination. And once you've got those laid out on the screen or in your XML, you can start connecting them with actions. So that's just a simple click and drag, no key press required. And you also can have IDs with those, obviously. And they also contain a destination of where they're going. So that's all very simple to lay out in the editor to get the actions and the destinations all connected that way.
Since it's an XML file, can you have multiple ones for like abstracting it apart so you don't have one monolithic navigation?
Now that's a very good question. So yes, these can be nested. So you could prune back a branch into a nested graph.
Okay.
So these do have the ability to nest, which is helpful. And then you don't get as cumbersome of a editor view. So if you have a lot and they're spreading out, you could prune that away, nesting them.
You mentioned that there's a little home icon for the starting point. What if you have an app that might have a variable starting point? Maybe it's a login screen sometimes and a home screen if you're already logged in.
And that's a good question. So you'd use conditional navigation with that. And so you would add some conditional logic with those actions for if they were required to be logged in, go this route. So that's another feature that the navigation graph does support, which comes up a lot. It will in my app because it's a subscription-based thing. So I will have to make sure they log in and make sure they're subscribed. And so once we've got the actions and the destinations defined, we can look at another core part is the nav host fragment. So the navigation host is an empty container where the fragments are going to be loaded. So you have to insert that in your main activities layout. This is the area where I want the fragments loaded, or in your different controls like tab controls. So you have to designate where are these destinations going to load, and that's part of the XML of your main activity. And let's see. And so the default nav host true, there's a property for that. You have to set that to true to ensure that it'll intercept the back button. So that's an important detail to remember when you're adding those, is to set that to true, and then it'll take control of the back button and automate that functionality for you, link it up with the back stack. And so when you want to navigate to destinations programmatically, you have to declare a nav controller. So that's an object that's going to manage the app navigation within the nav host. So that's going to say when we make the transition between the destinations. And to do that, you take your nav controller object and you call the navigate method, and then you're going to pass in the ID of the destination you want to go to. And it's as simple as that. So you put that code throughout your fragments of when it's time to change. And so now a lot of existing apps, including mine, that I want to rewrite to try all these new features, didn't use nav controller. So it would be helpful to migrate to nav controller from an app that didn't already use it. And there's 4 steps for that, to where you have to take your UI specific logic out of your activities. And so that could be a major refactor depending on how you wrote your app. So in my case, doing that is probably going to constitute a rewrite because my app is very small.
So is it better then to start your app with the navigation component? Or
I would say because it's a recommended, I think that would save you trouble down the road. So the
transitioning is a little bit of legwork.
Yeah, so you might have to refactor depending, because if you weren't worried about this when you wrote your app at all, you have manual places in your app where you're telling it to change to launch a new activity. So you're going to have to go in and take out the UI logic. You'll have to add the navigation component, which means adding in the graph and declaring the nav controller in the right places. You'll have to add the destinations, and you'll have to find anywhere that you use start activity to launch a new activity and replace that using your navigation controller and navigate calls there. And you might have to combine some activities to see, so you can combine them if they share a common layout. So if you have 2 that look almost the same, you could refactor that and leverage the navigation component and make less code, less classes, less layouts to have to deal with that way.
So Jen, what I'm curious about then is how you would go about animating from these transitions.
Okay, well, in the properties window for your actions, there's actually a place you can add an animation there. And I know that you can custom define some animations using our favorite XML files. So you just pick a type of transition and set that up, and you can customize it. And it's really easy to drop that in just using the editor.
On the note of transitions, it's one of the most mind-boggling bugs with fragments that's been around for a long time, is that when you press the back button and you're returning on the back stack, its behavior was the opposite of an activity. So in an activity, the most recent window is always on top. So if you go to a new screen, the new screen's on top, and when you navigate backwards, the new screen is on top as it animates away. With a fragment, they may have the entering transition always be in front. So enter, new screen comes in the back stack, you hit back, and now the previous screen is now re-entering. So it flips them around, and the exiting screen animates behind it, which made it impossible. It was literally impossible to do an animation in which screen B slid up and then slid down while the screen behind it stayed static, to create a modal-like animation. So they finally fixed that after about 2 or 3 years of that bug being open. But the next version of the Jetpack Fragments library is finally going to have this fixed.
Yay.
Wow, that is really cool background information. So I'd never attempted a slide-in transition between fragments before. So thank you. And that is another detail to mention too. There's on enter, on exit. So you have to pick where you want your effect on which event.
So, Jenn, what have you found most helpful, intriguing, enjoyable? What's the best thing that you've come across in using the navigation controller and the navigation components?
I like how it's a lot of the tasks are automated. So the back button functionality is kind of built right in once you add the component in and set it up. I also like the visual of the app. So now there's like, I hesitate to call it a storyboard now, but there's a flow chart between your destinations. And so that is just a helpful visual all around to keep the app in your mind.
Have you tried there's a Gradle plugin for handling passing arguments to a new fragment. Have you tried that?
I have not. Do you use that?
I haven't used it, but it's a way to get type safe fragment arguments when navigating between fragments on your in your graph. But I'm curious. I haven't heard of many people who've used it, but it seems like potentially a pretty powerful tool.
We'll have to put a link to that into the show notes so that people can look into that.
Yes, definitely.
Jenn, is there anything else that you want to add in?
No, I think that about covers all my knowledge of navigation component at this time. Hopefully I'll learn more as I use it more in the future.
Jenn, that was really very helpful information. You know that I'm working on the iOS app that my most requested feature has been porting it to Android. And you know that I've been completely daunted with getting into Android, but hearing the way that the nav component works really does feel like being at home with storyboards. And I think since mine is very storyboard driven, that may be very much of an assistance to me. Was that even English?
It must be getting late.
It must be.
Right. If you want a blueprint with navigation components in Mavericks, there's in the Mavericks repo, there's a module called Dogs, and it's a fake dog adoption app.
Oh, cool.
Great. I saw you demoing that in your talk.
Yeah, right. So the new one uses data binding and it uses navigation components. So.
Oh, that is cool. I will take a look at that.
Gabriel, really thank you for being on the show, all the information, seeing yet again that I'm pretty sure that reactive is the way of the future for all of us. Mavericks sounds like it is just an incredible, even first step for some folks. And I, again, want to thank you for being on the show tonight.
And thank you so much for having me. It's really been a pleasure.
That's going to wrap things up for this episode. We're going to be back in another few weeks with Chris Baines, who, at least from what Gabriel's told me, also uses Mavericks. So maybe we'll ask him about that. Until then, that's going to wrap things up for the Ray Wenderlich podcast. We thank Triple Byte, that's Byte, B-Y-T-E, for sponsoring this and every episode this season. But in the meantime, it's back to the Emerald Castle. Ray, back to you.
And that's a wrap. Thanks again, everybody, for listening to the RayWenderlich.com podcast. We hope you enjoyed it, and don't forget to leave a rating on iTunes. See you next time.